Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. As part of Boom and Bust's 2021 election coverage, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Ian Brodie, a former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Ian is now a professor of political science at the University of Calgary, specializing in Canadian and global affairs. Ian, welcome to the program.
I'm pleased to be here, Tony. Good to see you.
So great to have you on the program, of course. And of course, we're into the home stretch of the federal election campaign. So I really have to start with this important yet general question. What do you make of it all? Were there any big surprises to you or shocks to you as this campaign has unfolded?
I think there's two surprises I have, Tony. I don't remember since 1979, maybe, since Joe Clark kind of got into an election by accident, a prime minister who's been sucked into an election campaign and looked so ill-prepared. It was Mr. Trudeau's choice to have this election kind of half in the middle of the summer and half in September, to call an election way ahead of any necessary schedule. And yet he seemed to have nothing that really hooked the election on for the first 3 or 4 weeks. And even now in the home stretch of the campaign, it's unclear. He's clear he doesn't want to have the Conservatives win, but what's his case for the future? What's his case for 4 more years? There doesn't seem to be much there. They gave a lot of thought to how they were going to govern over the last 18 months through COVID, but calling an election, I expected him to come out of the start of the election with a strong message of what his case was for the next 4 years, and I don't think he's made it. The other surprise I've had, and to go to your boom and bust theme here, we're coming off a year and a half where they've spent whatever $500 billion, almost inconceivable amounts of money to get through this COVID crisis. All of it, in a sense, fake cash because it's been printed by the Bank of Canada rather than borrowed or taxed. They've thrown money around, in really genuinely unprecedented ways. And yet the election, there hasn't been a sharp fiscal division between the major parties. I expected Mr. Trudeau to come with, here's another $1 trillion I'd like to spend. And those were, I think, the hints before the campaign began that he had this big, ambitious, multi-trillion-dollar program. They plainly backed away from that, I assume because the polling showed people didn't really want that. But we also haven't had much of a discussion about returning to some sense of fiscal normal or monetary normal. How do we get back to kind of business as usual here? So in that sense, I think the campaign has left us without those big fiscal questions answered here. And that does not bode well for the next year or so of trying to get us through the economic waters.
And yet we had a prime minister who now infamously said during the campaign he wasn't going to concern himself with monetary policy because he cared too much about people. And of course, the latest news is the August inflation rate being around 4%. So clearly there are some storm clouds in the horizon.
Well, on that front, you're entirely right. The polling shows that the number 2 or number 3 issue is rising cost of living, the cost of living spinning out of control. I hear this every time I go into the grocery store, somebody commenting about cost of living issues. Of course, monetary policy is the cost of living issue. He started the campaign by saying, I don't really care about your cost of living because I care about people. Okay, fine. He got away with that, I think, during the course of this campaign. But whether he cares about the cost of living or not, the cost of living cares about him and it cares about us. I just think we're into now this uncharted territory of extraordinary monetary. You and I thought 2008, 2009 was a bit wild.
Right.
Spending money, huge deficits, extraordinary monetary policy. It turns out that was just the tiny amuse-bouche, the little appetizer for COVID, where even the rules we thought we had in 2008 are now completely out the door. And I don't get the sense that there was much discussion in this election campaign of how incredibly dangerous this situation is. And the Americans are pretending this can last forever. It looks like we're going to pretend this can last forever. But of course, the wit who said if it can't last forever, eventually it's going to come to an end, and this is going to come to an end.
I want to delve in this. We're going to take a brief break, Ian, but this is very important, not only about the course of the election campaign, but of course, how it impacts on people and their cost of living and their ability to survive all this. So stay tuned. We're going to be back with Dr. Ian Brodie from the University of Calgary after the break. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary, Dr. Ian Brodie. Ian, you talked before the break about the fiscal side of things as well as the monetary, of course, the spending that's going on. And you made the point, and maybe we should just unpack it a little bit more, that the political parties really don't have a lot of radically different points of view on fiscal policy, that is to say, taxing and spending. But this is an issue that should concern all Canadians. So I guess a two-parter for you. Has a debate about fiscal issues had its due in this campaign? And if not, what does that mean for the future?
I would say that all of the parties have been scared of the idea of returning to something that looks like a balanced budget. I mean, the Conservatives under Mr. O'Toole at least mentioned the possibility that we might want to rein in this extraordinary borrowing, printing money era that we're in. But over the next 10 years, don't worry, there won't be any budget cuts in the next 4 or 5 years. If we're elected here, we'll make this disappear over a long period of time, and that's fine. That may be what people want to hear, and we're still got echoes of COVID across the country in different ways in different parts of the country. But I think you and I both know that that's not the way this is going to play out in the real world. There's going to be a hard stop at some point when everybody wants to print money and everybody wants to issue a bond float, and it turns out that's the day it just all falls apart. And I didn't get the sense there was much acknowledgement of the harsh reality that at some point this isn't going to come to a gentle end. This is going to come to a sudden end, and we don't really know how the parties would handle that kind of very serious economic crisis if we trip over it. And it's not likely to start in Canada, of course. I assume it's likely to start in the United States because of the extraordinary fiscal and monetary situation there. If the markets lose confidence in the Americans' ability to manage through this, we're not going to start this, but we're going to be the collateral damage in that process. And I haven't heard anything during the election campaign around that. I think is a likely scenario.
I also take your point that there hasn't been as much as I thought there would be about a discussion about a post-COVID recovery, what a post-COVID economy looks like. Can you read through the tea leaves of the party platforms and give us your assessment of what preparations each political party would be inclined to do in a post-COVID world?
Well, here, I think the worst case scenario has been avoided. It looked back in May and June like both of the major parties were going to propose more repatriation of supply lines to Canada, cutting off global connections for our dependence on protective equipment and medical products and pharmaceuticals and so on, which the Americans can talk about because of the size of their economy and the huge industrial base of the United States. Because it's one thing for Biden to say we're going to make more of this stuff at home in Canada or in the United States. Right. For us in Canada, that is a tricky business. The economy is smaller. We just don't have the industrial base to bring back all of these. So you have to approach this subject with a bit more creativity. And maybe with, we're not going to be dependent on China. Okay, fine. But we've got to work with like-minded countries around the world to help manage this risk. So far, the election didn't feature a really strongly nationalistic appeal on economic issues and COVID issues like that. And I think we avoided the worst case here. What it has meant is the two parties are talking about more government-directed industrial policy. They both want advanced project agencies in the federal government to sponsor innovation and economic development in the future. neither of the parties presents a very compelling case about turbocharging economic growth. And that's strange considering how much the economy has shrunk during the course of COVID. It seems to be all the parties are assuming somehow the economy is just going to bounce back. But you've seen the capital investment numbers have basically cratered in the last 6 years.
Right.
We're giving away growth opportunities in the economy in Western Canada and elsewhere at a remarkable pace, and there's nothing there to replace it in the pipeline. I hope that once now the election's over, I guess we'll see the election over, we can get to a discussion. Maybe these issues are too important to be discussed during an election campaign, as Kim Campbell said, but now we need to focus on how do we get that growth back for jobs, for getting people back into the productive economy and earning our way in a world that's getting more and more competitive.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Ian Brodie. He is a professor of political science at the University of Calgary. Ian, obviously one of your specialties is observing and commenting on Canada-US relations. We talked a little bit about that before the break, but it's clear that the Biden administration has an aggressive trade agenda, and it probably will have all sorts of impacts, but love for you to talk a little bit about that trade agenda, how it impacts of Canada, what Canada should be doing about it.
I have been surprised so far, Tony, that since Biden was elected, in a sense, Canada's been a bit disconnected from his trade agenda. You think at the early stages, if Biden wanted to improve relations with allies around the world, he might want to reconnect with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the British Brexit process, creates trade wrinkles for the United States and for Canada and for the Europeans. There could have been that Canadian opportunity for leadership to go down and say to Biden, look, if you want to regularize this situation, there's issues of the WTO left over from Trump's time in office. We can help you with that. And the way to do it is to let us help you with TPP, Britain, Europe, WTO, resettlement of trade issues. And that opportunity was really profoundly lost. And I don't think it can be recovered right now. And it goes along with, I think, really serious missed opportunity, again, at the beginning of Biden's term in office, of saying, let's have a conversation about reopening the border to traffic in both ways on the same basis, right? I mean, I really think I'm going to be careful about people trying to manage through the pandemic because I know it was difficult. But I think the Trudeau government really blew it in not prioritizing that in the very early stages of the Biden transition in the first few days that Biden was in office. And that opportunity is now lost permanently. I don't think that's going to be recuperated. And we'll be living with that for the next 4 or 5 years at least, as Canada and the United States manage the two sides of the border in different ways, on different schedules, with different standards of vaccination and health measures. This is a really serious lost opportunity that we have nobody to blame but ourselves on that, because the Americans will never think about this sort of thing unless the Canadian Prime Minister goes down and says, we should manage this process together.
I mean, you raise an excellent point, and obviously one of the obvious parts about this is the fact that Canadians can't really travel across the land border, whereas the Americans can do so. To me, it's unprecedented that we have a different take on whether our border is open or not. I can't imagine. If I was going to predict something out of the pandemic, that would have been the least of my predictions. So you're saying that that's kind of a harbinger or an indicator that all is not well in terms of our trade policies, our North American context policies, that there's a bit of a disconnect there, right?
I think that, look, you and I were part of a sort of 15-year process of trying to harmonize border issues, work through the Nexus card for getting frequent flyers or frequent travelers across the border with a minimum of fuss to try and take some of the friction out of moving people and goods across the border. Goods are still moving, so I don't want to overstate the problem here. But at the beginning of Mr. Biden's time in office was the time to go down and say, remember, we have this. We've invested tens of billions of dollars in this Nexus infrastructure. We'd like to double down on that. Can we build coming out of COVID and the vaccine and public health issues around the existing infrastructure we have on Nexus and the global entry system that the Americans have, the Americans will never think about this unless a Canadian leader, a prime minister, goes down and says, let's do it this way, because if we can get the Canada-US piece done, the rest of the globe could follow that. And for whatever reason, and I still don't understand it, I don't think it occurred to anybody in Ottawa that we needed to take charge of that process early. And that is a lost opportunity, which is a dead loss to the Canada-US relationship. I don't see we're going to be able to make that up, no matter what the government does over the course of the coming year.
Can I return a little bit to supply chains? Because that's something I'm interested in, and I've had a lot of different guests talking about supply chains. We might have to go over the break a little bit on this, but obviously there are different things that have come up during the pandemic. Let me frame it for you, then we'll talk about it after the break. But obviously our lack of supply of PPE because it was coming from China, the vaccine issue because we initially relied, or the Canadian government initially relied on China. That was a bad bet. So there's a lot of talk about, some domestic production, just as a matter of national security and national safety. And I take your point that there's also the North American context. So let's get into that after the break. We'll hear from Ian about those issues. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Dr. Ian Brodie. He is a former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper, now a Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. And Ian, I kind of framed it before we had to go to commercial break about reshoring, onshoring. President Biden calls it friend-shoring to widen it out. Maybe that's what you're interested in, that it's not just about producing stuff in Canada, but with our allies as well. I guess the main point of connection on this is not a good idea to rely overly on China as the production locus for a lot of these strategic or national security or health security products. Your comments, please.
Well, look, we're in this, we got into this public health crisis 2 years ago. And so obviously innovative solutions on the vaccine side and on the treatment side were needed. I would not, if I'd been in this situation to make a bet on Chinese innovation over American innovation. I just think of this kind of crisis situation when a rapid, high quality turnaround of a health product is needed. Why would you bet on anybody else other than the Americans being first to market with a viable solution here? And a whole suite of viable solutions, it turns out, because of the depth of their biomedical and pharmaceutical industry. Of course, they were going to be first to market with 2 or 3 choices of really high quality vaccines to solve this problem or to help solve this problem for us. Our piece of this, it seems to be, it was clear early on in the process, we have the high quality pulp and paper industry. If you're looking for masks to help us with reduction of infection rate and the inserts that go into medical masks and so on and so forth, that's going to be produced in Canada. Why? Because we have the world beating pulp and paper industry here, right? Not just for print purposes and for newsprint purposes, but really for that extraordinarily high quality medical purposes. That's, you're going to make a bet on Canada and maybe Sweden and Norway over anybody else in the world. That's our strength. And, this then becomes a political issue. Can we play that across the border to remind the Americans for all of these N95 masks and so forth, it's really we're the world quality producer on that. Of course, they're the world quality producer or inventor in vaccines. Are we going to build some capacity here for replicating some of those vaccines here in Canada? I expect we will over the next 5 years. That's going to be expensive, but we've done it in the past, and there's no reason to think that we couldn't do that again in the future. But again, this is an area where the government has to provide the framework for the business, private sector community, and private investment and private inventors to go and do the really heavy lifting on very short notice to turn around supply chains and to turn around production facilities in almost no time. I think we've done okay on this, but there were missed opportunities here. We can't miss in the course. If we're going to a situation where you need an annual booster shot for COVID, in the way that you need an annual booster shot for the common influenza strains each year, that's an issue we're going to have to build over the course of the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And I expect we'll see a rebalancing of some of these. And I don't think we'll ever see another Canadian government say, let's bet on China's innovation cycle rather than America's innovation cycle here. That was just that was a foolish bet to begin with, and has proven itself over the last year and a half.
We've got about a minute left, but let me just marry a couple of those things together, because President Biden has been very clear. He's set up all of these task forces about supply chain, whether it's semiconductors, critical minerals, PPE. Shouldn't we be having a dialogue with them, saying, hey, here we are, we're Canada, we want to be part of that discussion about securing our supply chains?
Well, during that transition period between the U.S. election and President Biden taking office, I had phone calls every week from friends of mine in Washington wanting to open up a Canada-U.S. dialogue on the rare earth metals and the critical mineral resources, because we're so dependent on China here. And they had figured out across the board, both Republicans and Democrats in the United States, we can't depend on China for PPE. We can't depend on China for pharmaceutical production. And the looming issue that's right on our doorstep is all of these rare earth metals and other critical minerals. We can't be dependent on China for that. Canada is a natural source for that, and we love dealing with the Canadians on this. We love the regulatory.
You're going to have to cut to the chase because we're almost out of time. So nothing happened. Is that what happened?
I think we've lost that up, but that will come back. We've got to nail that down for next year.
Yes, we do. I agree with you 100%. Ian Brodie, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. Always some great insights, and you're certainly our friend of the program now. Thanks for your
Great.
attendance.
Good to talk to you, Tony.
For sure. Thank you. Always some great insights from Ian Brodie from Calgary on so many issues: the election campaign, supply chains, Canada, U.S. I'd love to have him back on the program, but thanks for watching today. Very interesting.